So yeah, so I very small group for us to start, which actually could be useful because I was thinking of splitting people into pairs for the activity coming up anyway. So we'll have one pair, which would be great. But this is to talk about creativity. I am labeling myself a bit of a creativity theorist at the moment because I'm talking a lot about creativity theory for one of the courses I'm developing. And I realized that it's an area where it doesn't matter which discipline you're in, you've kind of got something you want to say about this. And I also want to look at it from a study skills perspective as well, of how do we try and make ourselves more creative? How do we come to express ourselves? How do we find that self-actualization, which is epitomizing that very sort of nuanced way in which we develop our skills. So the very pinnacle of what we want to do as students, I think, or as learners generally. Let's not say students, because it never really stops this aspect of our learning. So one of quotes I've quoted quite often is from Norman Jackson, who's talked a lot about developing creativity in higher education. And he says, the world needs people who can combine their thinking, knowledge, capabilities, and values in imaginative ways to work with complexity, create wealth and prosperity, tackle intractable social environmental problems, enrich cultures, and enhance their own well-being. Universities have a vital role to play in creating more creative societies. But all too often, the creative development of learners is an outcome of higher education, is more by accident than design. So how do we design a university that is more capable and willing to support the creative development of students? I think, to be honest, in some ways, Cambridge is very well placed to do just this. Better placed than some universities simply because there's a more ingrained approach to developing multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary thinking. I'm going to circle back to that thought at the end of this session. But it's this idea that you are treated as an individual, but you're also recognizing that there are world problems that we need to address. And we start to feel that these are our problems to deal with. We have seen certain new universities. In fact, I think the first time in 30 years, a university has gained the ability to confer degrees. This hasn't happened for 30 years, a new university coming along and saying we want to confer degrees, but the London Interdisciplinary School is one of those. Obviously, interdisciplinarity is central to that, the idea that we are global actors, we are working within a global framework, and we're dealing with global problems. And so there's an ever greater emphasis on problems rather than on disciplinary research, which is not to say disciplinary research isn't part of that. And that's why I tend to prefer multidisciplinary to interdisciplinary, i.e. I can be an expert in genomics, but I need to be able to speak to people in, epidemiology. So we need to be able to bring together people from different disciplines, but we need the specialism, but we also need people to be able to communicate better and work around problems better. And increasingly, creativity has made its way up the rung of important skills we want students to develop. Interestingly, I remember syllabuses that I would have been studying when I was a student would have all had, will become more creative as an outcome. And yet I don't remember ever talking about creativity or what creativity was or how I was becoming more creative. It was just expected that it would happen. And that's what Norman Jackson is talking about when he says it's an accident rather than design. And yet one of the courses I had to develop was about creativity theory. It was about deliberately making people think about creativity and be more creative. So in that sense, I had to design a course that would actively work on people's creativity. And what I learned was, don't define creativity. By which I mean, almost every book on creativity will open with, you cannot define creativity, but here's the definition I prefer. They all start that way. There are no good definitions of creativity, but here's the one I like. That is pretty much what I'm saying to you here, I suppose, in a way, but the way in which I put that is to say definitions can be helpful. I've never seen a definition of creativity that hasn't in some way illuminated my thinking around what creativity is. But at the same time, none of them captures exactly what I want creativity to be recognized as. And that suggests two things. It suggests that I already know what it is, and I'm relying on this definition to help me in some way. But two, it's also suggesting that maybe we don't want a definition for creativity, because the whole idea of creativity is that we bend or break the rules. If I'm told how to be creative, don't I want to say, well, actually, I'm going to be creative in a completely different way. So the wonderful Margaret Bowden has come up with this definition that it's the ability to come up with products, ideas, or artifacts that are new, surprising, and of value. We're going to tear that to pieces in an activity that I've got planned with the next slide. In particular, the question of surprising. Far too many teachers are still saying, a student's creative if they surprise me. And I don't think that's right, for reasons we'll come to. But the new and of value seems to be relevant to most people as well. But there are plenty of cases where, for instance, we invented steel twice, the human race, that is. We invented concrete twice. Arguably, the second time was worse than the first. But in any case, the person who invented it the second time didn't know how to do it, didn't know how it was done the first time. So was it less creative because it wasn't new? It's of value, though. Both of those things are valuable to us. So there's all these questions around how new, how much of value, new to whom, of value to whom, and so on. So we can challenge every aspect of this, but it's still useful because it's saying, you kind of know what I mean. You know what I'm getting at. And in that respect, I think we all can say, yeah, I kind of already know what creativity is, and I want a definition to try and help me. But what's interesting here is that there is clearly some value to every one of these definitions. And we clearly recognize that those people have certain talents. But at the same time, we have to recognize that creativity is very rarely up to us. It's not something that I can just call upon and become more creative. I can't go to creativity school and come out more creative than I was before. And if I did, wouldn't everyone have done that? In which case I would suddenly have a fudge factor that would reduce my grade. But it's creativity, like leadership, are one of those skills where if you're told how to do it, you aren't doing it. So that's not what I'm going to be doing today. I'm much more going to be about asking you guys to think about this, to challenge this thing, some of these ideas, and to think in different ways about what creativity means to you. Another interesting aspect of this is that rules have a kind of weird relationship here, and self has a weird relationship here. So, for instance, we think that rules limit what we can do, and yet at the same time we get Picasso saying something like, learn the rules like a pro so you can break them like an artist. And indeed, many of my pieces of advice around study skills are often teaching you the rules of how to write an essay, or the rules of how to develop an argument. And then I say, but that's not where I want you to stop. I want you to then think about what you want to do with the rules after the fact. So that's where the creativity comes in. Great. But how do I do that? How do I, as a student, as a learner, make that happen? And the answer is you can't just turn it on. It's something that's going to happen to you. So you'll probably know the very famous I think therefore I am, to which Nietzsche said, you're wrong with the first two words. You're already wrong. Nietzsche says to Descartes, says, I think, how do you know that? How do you know that you're thinking? Don't thoughts occur to me? Right? So I don't bring thoughts into reality. The thoughts occur to me. When Archimedes got in his bath and watched the water change as a result and saw pressure, and this solved a problem for him, he said, Eureka, allegedly. The thing is, he wasn't planning to have his Eureka moment by getting in the bath. He got in the bath and had a Eureka moment. So thoughts occurred to him, but they had to occur to him. It would have been weirder if he'd got in the bath, the water level had changed, and then someone 2 doors down suddenly had the Eureka that he could solve his problem. It doesn't work that way. It has to happen to me, but at the same time, it's not something I make happen. So the role of self is interesting here. I'm a recipient. I'm not a creator. I don't create in that sense. So in any way, this is just to say creativity may be impossible to define, but we kind of already know what we're talking about, because everything I've probably said to you so far, you've nodded along or said, yeah, okay, that seems to make sense to me. Okay, why do I challenge some of these definitions? Well, one of the exercises I'd like us to do now, and this is the only time I'm going to ask you to speak and beg you to speak, if anything, on this question, is to come up with a question to which the answer is Paris. So we've got a few more people who've joined us now. We've got 5 people here, so not a huge group. So there is a bit of pressure on you guys, I know, but I've done this exercise before. Everyone's always had fun doing it. I'm looking for a kind of Jeopardy style question, where you play Jeopardy, you get the answer, and then you have to say, what is the capital of France? By the way, you can ignore that one because that's not going to be creative. But what I'd like you to do is come up with a question for which the answer is Paris, and I want you to try and make it as creative as possible, whatever that might mean. Okay, so I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. I'll start a timer. We'll make it 2 minutes. So work on that for just a couple of minutes, and then we'll see what we've come up with. Okay, go. So I should have put a disclaimer at the start, shouldn't I? You will be expected to be creative. One more minute. Okay, that's 2 minutes. Right. What have we got? Who wants to go first? Go on then, Moritz.
Yeah, so I had a very creative, annoying one. So no, I don't know if it's creative, but what capital in Europe starts with a P and ends with an S?
Okay.
And I wonder how you're gonna explain that. but that's some question you would never ask, right? Because it's super stupid.
I like the fact that you broke my rule as well, because I said no one do that one. No one do the capital of France thing. But
in
you
Europe,
found a way
capital
around
in Europe.
Yeah, no, indeed. No, I like it. I like it. It's good. Yeah. Anyone else? Go on, Ellie.
Excuse my bucket hat. I'm manifesting summer. I'm just going to put that out there. Okay. One was where is the Disney film Ratatouille set?
Okay.
Which is a bit neat. And then
yeah, I love it.
The most visited European capital with 5 letters. I sort of just assumed it was the most visited.
Yeah. We could do a bit of research though and prove that right. Absolutely. Yeah. No, like it. Anyone else? Go on then, Tom.
I'm sorry, this is awful, but which European city is Sirap backwards? Oh, sorry, I'm sorry.
Okay. Do we all have something?
No.
With letters.
Yeah, so that follows a trend. No, Tom, that's very much in the line of things that I tend to hear. So I've had various different answers to this. I'm going to assume that that's it for answers, unless anyone else. Okay. So I've had, for instance, what's the correct way to spell rap backwards? P-A-R is. I thought that was quite a nice one that someone came up with. P-A-R is. I think there was what's an English religious district minus the last letter? Parish minus the H. There've been what's an interesting way of misspelling pears? The word pears. Okay, so all sorts of different kinds of answers I get to this question, and there are no correct or incorrect answers. And in fact, I insist that that is not a test of your creativity. And I have singularly failed to come up with a test of your creativity, if that's what it was. The creativity comes in when I ask the question, what are we measuring there? What are we actually coming up with those answers to do? If problem solving and relevance seem to be important, then you could see how this might be problem solving plus relevance. But is the Sistine Chapel solving a problem, and is it relevant? It might be solving the problem of what the hell does we put on this roof? What do we make the ceiling look like? And it solves that problem. It solves the problem of what does Michelangelo do for several years of his life. But it doesn't solve a problem like a toaster solves a problem, right? So I've always had an issue with this kind of question. And the reason I mentioned surprising and why I didn't like it is because most people see this kind of test as if you surprise me, if you come up with an answer that shocks me, then you're creative. To which my response is, why should my surprise make you creative? And it's fundamentally the wrong way around. It's still based on this way of thinking that learning is about me giving you facts, you giving me answers, and you surprising me with how well you can tell me what I already know. And so I've heard really great people on this topic. In fact, people based in centers of creativity saying this to me, that what I want is for students to surprise me. And I said, but what if someone says, what's a way of misspelling pears? Because when they were writing this question down on their iPad, it did an autocorrect and made it P-A-I-R-S. Does that make them creative because they spotted that? Does it make someone more creative because they just came out of a lecture in classics on the Iliad and they think of Paris, the Prince of Troy? It doesn't make someone more creative, right? So it's the influences that led to us giving our answers don't help us at all. So it's not about product, it's much more about process. If you've got the answer ready to hand, you're probably not being creative. If you have to work for it, connect ideas in a surprising way, surprising to you, I mean. So when you surprise yourself, that's when I think you're being creative. Again, that role of self, of I've done something here which I wasn't expecting me to do. I had a friend who used to write musicals, and he then wrote for film and then wrote for TV. So he's got progressively more mundane, he would say. He listened to his musical back again. It was based on the Pythagoreans of Greece. Apparently this was put on in a theatre in London at some point. And he listened back to the music and he was like, this is actually really good. How could I do something this good? And it's because he was probably more creative at that stage in his career because he had less to lose. Right, so there was a sense in which he was being more creative when he was, your age or a little bit older, rather than as he went on to do a career where I've got those processes all set up for me. So anyway, so this is just to say, this kind of test is not a test of your creativity at all. If anything, it's whether you surprised yourself with what you came up with. But I also want to talk a little bit about that from the individual point of view, because I keep showing you this throughout all these study hack sessions, Maslov's hierarchy of needs. And it's because, okay, we're all taking care of those bottom ones at the moment, especially important, those bottom ones at the moment, because, life's been disrupted. We've got to worry about our mental well-being and all sorts of things like that, keeping our relationships going, which is the middle rung. And then, working on making sure that we're getting those sense of accomplishments through doing exercises like the last one and saying, yeah, I got a good answer to that. But it's that self-actualization. It's the bit that we never got to in that exercise. At no point was I going to let you self-actualize through that kind of exercise. I want to, by the way. It's not that I'm trying to stop you. It's just through that kind of exercise is never going to do that. What is going to do that? Well, not treating an essay as something I have to get done, but treating an essay as something that I want to get done, and I'm going to enjoy the process of doing it, and so on. Realizing one's full potential. I've got to be me first and foremost, and I've got to be able to deliver that work myself, and surprise myself, make myself happy with what I've done. So I tend to shy away from this question of what creativity is and ask students themselves, when do you think you are most creative? So let me do that now. When and where would you each say that you are creative? Moritz, by the way, I'm just going to say, green walls, the way to go. Apparently, you should paint your walls green if you want to be more creative, I'm told.
Oh, I would say
It does.
yellow.
Really yellow. Yeah, no, I could see that. But apparently green is it. It's like going out into nature really helps with creativity as well. Sorry, I stopped you. What? Yeah.
Biodiversity.
Indeed. So yeah, when and where are you creative?
Yeah, not green walls. Yellow. No. I would say late in the night after I've worked a long time on the same topic. So like 6 hours on the same topic, no distraction, and then late in the night, that's when I'm getting creative.
That's really interesting. Yeah. So some people say just as I'm falling to sleep or just as I'm waking up, which is a terrible time to have to take notes, to come up with all your best ideas at the moment when you're the furthest away from a notepad and any inclination to write anything. But no, that's right. I mean, making connections, right? Letting things settle, making things sort of connect with each other in the back of your mind. As I said, the subconscious is doing so much more than we think it's doing when it's providing this information to us. That's not to say we aren't involved. We let that happen, but it's just to say that we need that space. For me, I call it creative space, but really it's about time. But creative space is about going into the right place, like I said, into nature, into a green space, to get time, and you'll let your subconscious do some work for you in the background. Any other examples? Mine's walking the dog. I have a lot of great ideas when I'm walking the dog. Mm-hmm. The dog would probably claim credit for that, but it's not me either. But it's being able to just sort of run through things in my head, and it's not when I'm trying to think about it. It's when I stop, and then, as Moritz said, it comes to me, and it's just suddenly, okay, I can see the connection now. And it's interesting that it's when we make those connections, it's things that we care about. We suddenly care about these things more. So it's the things that will come to you from your note taking and so on will be something that interested you during the day. So you would have felt interest at the time of reading or writing about it. And then later it's when now I make those connections. There's a reason why there are connections around things that interest us. And you can be more interested in things, by the way, without those things being interesting. What I mean is, you can manifest interest in a topic. So I had to teach Descartes. I keep mentioning Descartes. I had to teach Descartes for the first time about 10 years ago. And I thought, how am I going to do this? I hate him. I can't stand Descartes. When I studied him, I just thought he's wrong. And then I realized, yeah, but most people still kind of agree with his conclusions, but it's wrong. So I said to the students as they came in the door, you're all Cartesians, or almost all of you are Cartesians. You all believe you have a mind and that you have a body. You're now going to read the book that created that idea, and you're going to say, this is rubbish. And then you're going to walk out of this room as Cartesians, which is a problem, right? That should be a problem for you. And so that's a way into to making it more interesting, is to engage with it at a level of a problem that's not necessarily a problem in the ideas, but a problem for me. It's something that I've got to get interested in. So that's to help answer this question of why we're talking about creativity. Is we want to move towards that self-actualization. The closer it is to you, the more likely it is to be something you get creative about. This also speaks to Bloom's hierarchy, by the way. Perfect that I get these two pyramids, right? Again, just purely by chance, you've got Maslow's hierarchy and you've got Bloom's pyramid, which Bloom, by the way, this is the updated Bloom. Bloom originally had synthesis at the top, but many people have argued that is creativity, being able to make those connections, as we've just been saying, between ideas. Now, I would say most people probably spend most of their time doing the first two, remembering and understanding. You then apply probably about 20% of that. Is that fair to say? Of what you actually take in, you probably apply 20% in your essays. And so maybe a bit more, maybe 40, 50%, who knows? You're doing analyzing and evaluating as well through work, through the application. When it's good writing, when it's good essays, they're more evaluative and more analytical. When are you being creative though? And it is much rarer, right, that we're doing those kinds of creative things where we're taking work in a direction that surprises not just the people marking our essays, but me as well. I'm surprised I was able to wring that much interesting stuff out of this quite dry subject that I was writing on. I'm quite glad that I could do that. And again, that sense of fulfillment shouldn't come as a surprise when we're being creative. Those are the feelings that are associated with that kind of creativity. But it's just interesting that the emphasis is on these things. This is where we want to get to. Right? This is the advanced approaches to thinking. Only advanced students and learners reach that top end of the pyramid in each and every exercise they engage in. But that's where we want to get to, but it's what we're less focused on. We focus much more on the understanding, remembering, and so on, which is why I've always suggested in my previous sessions around notes, for instance, start at analyze and evaluate. Start there. Trust that you'll understand and remember it. Especially as you go into years 2 and 3, trust that you can't force your memory to remember things. You can't force yourself to remember anything, but you can trust your memory and help it to some extent. But if you begin in evaluating and analyzing, that does actually, evidence shows this is better for your memory anyway, because it's active. It's not passively storing information, it's actively engaged in articulating the problem, the question, the answer, and so on. And if you start there, you're far more likely to end with something creative. So it's about sort of kind of elevating and recognizing this is obviously a reduction and a kind of one purely theoretical account of how students and learners are working. But it's helpful because it helps us to recognize that we kind of want to keep pushing up the pyramid. And also, we tend to be a little bit bottom up rather than top down. So one thing that I've had to articulate to students quite often is that, you know, I use a hamster here, but it's a kind of like a call center. You know, if you're always on the phone, yeah, answer call, answer call, answer call. That's a little bit how we're treating the supervision essays. Get the essay written, get it done, get it done, get it done. Got to get through this. But that's busy work, and that's never going to lead to the top end of that pyramid. The person who steps back and can look at the team as a whole, can say, what's going on here? Why are we even doing what we're doing? Do we even need to make these calls? Do we even need to answer the phone? Do we need to be doing these sorts of? Once you step back and you have that kind of top-down approach where you're looking at it from a creative, analytic, evaluative position and looking down on why I need to understand, why I need to remember, that's the better way round of looking at it. Start at the top of the pyramid and look down, not at the bottom of the pyramid and look up. There's a wonderful philosopher, Simone Weil, who was asked by de Gaulle to write a new constitution for France after the war. I think he basically wanted it to be busy work. He wanted her to shut up because she was being problematic. She was asking him to get nurses to the front line and things like that. And he didn't want to send women to the front line. So he said, just write a new constitution. We'll deal with that after the war. We'll have a new France based on your constitution. And I think what he had in mind was something like égalité, fraternité, liberté, and another ité. Find another ité to add to the mix. What she wrote was the book, The Need for Roots. And it talks about how every street should have an educational establishment on it. And people are educated in all sorts of things, but you move from your street to your town, to your country, to the world. And so the need for roots is about a situatedness within the world. This came from her having gone to a Renault factory. She wanted to understand why poor people in France didn't rise up and revolt over the rich who were a minority. So why didn't the poor kind of throw off their shackles? And she realized because you can't mount a revolution based on apathy, which is exactly what gets created when you have people doing very procedural work of just, I'm making lights for Renault. That's what she was doing. She didn't know why, she didn't know what they were for. They weren't for cars, they were just lights. She was just putting bits together. She had no idea how it all fitted into anything else. And so she felt very mechanistic. So that was what she was trying to avoid and saying, we need to find a kind of situatedness, a rootedness. I've also been looking at the history of education in the West for certain courses that I've been running. And one of the things that comes across really clearly is that since the Humboldt model for education, which is what most modern universities are based on, the University of Humboldt in Berlin, the focus is on individual needs and global efforts. It's about you as an individual researching something to advance knowledge, and it's about fitting it into a global paradigm, into a global set of problems, a global endeavor. We're doing this for everyone, but I'm doing it on my own. Does that feel familiar, by the way? Feels very, I mean, there's a line that some people said the difference between Oxford and Cambridge is that Oxford create great leaders, we create great citizens. Right, so we don't want you to lead, we want you to be citizens. We want you to be people who are working together, not telling other people how to do it. So anyway, I will move off that polemical issue. But anyway, it's just that that's both of those, though, are ways of recognizing that we have individual needs and global efforts. And notice that kind of this is what the individual needs are what Maslov is talking about, reaching that self-enrichment, that sense of self-purpose. And the latter is about how we understand our work as fitting into a broader perspective. I have to take an interest now in what other people have said on my topic, about what other people are writing about my discipline. I have to take an interest in its history. I have to take an interest in where it's going now. And that's that last one in particular. Where is my discipline going now? What's currently driving things forward? What are people trying to do right now? And once you get both of those engaged, your own personal interest and an interest in your subject's history and its future, suddenly everything comes together and you get much more interested and invested in the subject. More on the how now, just to talk about this wonderful guy, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. That is how you pronounce it. I had to double check. I've learned this now, how to pronounce his name. But he wrote this book called Flow. And in it, he says, what we want to achieve is this state of flow. And I imagine all of you know what I'm talking about already. When the best essays you've ever written were the easiest to write. Is that fair? Because you genuinely cared about what you were writing about. All the best work we do is the stuff that we enjoy the most. And we don't necessarily know we're enjoying it when we're doing it because we're not out of the moment. We are fully invested in that moment. It's what the Greeks called ecstasis, which is where we get the word ecstasy from. But it's just to say that kind of real attunement to what I'm working on. And it comes about through having a high level of skill, which you all have, and a high level of challenge at the same time. So you're pushing yourself, even though you are fitting it to your skill set. Notice that if you have low skill but high challenge, that leads to anxiety. If someone's constantly pushing you, but you feel you don't have the ability, that's going to make you anxious. If you have a lot of skill and no one's pushing you, you relax. Now he says we basically want to avoid both of those and work towards a kind of combination of the two, which is both a kind of a sense of anxiety. The good aspects of anxiety come together with the good aspects of relaxation in the notion of flow. And that's what we're aiming for. Haven't I just re-described the thing that you all came here to try and learn how to do? And I haven't actually told you how to do it, though, which is unhelpful. I know. I'm going to get into a little bit more of the how in a moment, but it's helpful to know what we're aiming for and that other people have talked about this. And it's more to know that no one's got the answers here. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi is a very advanced psychologist. He's not giving us any answers to what we should be doing, specifically doing. So this is just to tell us this is what we should be aiming for. When we find ourselves doing this, that's what we should be embracing and trying to replicate as much as possible. So the second aspect of how relates to some of the practices that are associated with creative thinking. And one is the most common, which is divergent thinking. Starting with a problem and saying, what options do I have? And I said philosophy is quite good for this. I often compare philosophy with a prism. You introduce it into the light. So I'm certain. I walk into a classroom thinking, of course we have a mind and we have a body. And then Alex says, but that could be wrong. And I go, what? And then, so that opens my mind to other possibilities where maybe we don't need a mind and a body. Maybe that's a mistake. And so my views are diverging and they're kind of shattering into different colors. What philosophy then unfortunately has to do is do this and close it down again, puts another prism in to turn that spectrum back into white light because it wants new certainty, but to go in a different direction. So that's what philosophy is doing, breaking open our thinking and then closing it down again. And I think every subject is doing this insofar as it's being philosophical. There is philosophy related in every subject. Philosophy is the first interdisciplinary subject. You know, if you look, through education down to the bottom, you get to epistemologies and ontologies. If you look at science, ultimately you'll get down to this question of, is it realism or is it an epistemology? Are we finding new information or are we creating information? And so on and so on and so on. Sorry, I didn't mean to say you're all philosophers. I know no one wants to be that. And it's not a good thing to be.
But the idea you would argue it.
Sorry, Maurice, sorry.
As physicists don't like to hear that, I think.
Oh, tell me about it. I know. But I sat next to someone at a dinner once he was a chemist, and I said, you can't be a realist, because he was saying he was a realist. I said, you can't be a realist because you're a scientist. And he goes, of course I'm a realist. I'm a scientist. And I said, hang on, wait, we've got lost here. And he came to me after the next at the next dinner and said, you're right. Science is an epistemology, not an ontology. It tells us how to find things out. It doesn't tell us what things exist. And I hadn't even put it in those terms, but I was like, yeah, fine, brilliant. That's spot on. Which is just to say no one should be a realist, by the way. Anyway, so this idea of divergent thinking, I think, is helpful, but I think it assumes too much. For me, the problem is that it doesn't define the problem, and the problem is more important. Getting the question right is usually more important than trying to find out all the options for the answer. You have to get the right question before you can get anything like the right answer. This is why I prefer convergent thinking, which is about problem solving or decision making, which seem to be more related to what the problem actually is. How do we converge in on something that will actually help us, rather than how do we come up with different solutions to a perhaps made up problem? So divergent thinking would lead to the iPad. No one wanted an iPad, no one needed one, and then Steve Jobs made them up, and now everyone wants one, right? That's perfect example of divergent thinking. I'm going to create something that people want to see. I'm not going to ask them what they want and then give them that. I'm going to create something they're going to want. Convergent thinking is, I guess, something like the iPhone, maybe. How do we actually make things, a device that's useful and solves the kinds of problems that we're having at the moment? Connectability, being able to take your work with you. I know these were not actual problems, but they were problems that were perceived to exist. And how do we find it timely and right for the time? Notice, by the way, this isn't, again, one individual driving this forward. Not even Steve Jobs does that. External factors play as much of a role as an internal factor. What I prefer, though, is something called design thinking, because the way in which one of my friends who's an engineer put this is to say, it's about constantly and consistently asking the question, what is the problem? And interestingly, we were talking about this, and he was coming at it from an engineering perspective. I was coming at it from a philosophy perspective, and he said, it's perfect. It's exactly what. So he had a friend who at the start of the pandemic had a broken leg, and there was lockdown, but he wanted a wheelchair. And his friend, and this engineer said, why do you need a wheelchair? And he said, well, because that's my problem at the moment. I can't get around. He goes, no. What's your problem? And he said, well, I can't move around my flat. No, what's your problem? Well, I need to be able to get coffee. Okay. Let's come up with a solution for that. And he did. And he said, well, I need to get to the bathroom too. Well, I'll come up with a solution for that as well. And he did. And he came up with a solution for each of the actual problems that existed for this person. Likewise, I had a student who came to me. She was Danish. And she said, we have a real problem with immigrants coming into our country. And I said, okay, what's the problem? And she said, well, they don't speak the language. And I said, okay, what's the problem? And she went, oh, okay, well, they can't get access to services. And I said, so it's their problem. And she was like, oh, okay, yeah, I get that. All I'd done is ask, what's the problem? And forced her to reflect on what the actual problem was. And it turns out the problem wasn't her problem. It was a problem for other people. And then the solution becomes, well, maybe I can help them. Done, right? So it was, again, the philosophy and the engineering coming together in this process of design thinking, which is to empathize, which doesn't mean what you might think it means. It just simply means, where's the problem for a person? Invariably, when we're designing something, it's a problem for a person, whether it's we're trying to overcome a disability, or we're trying to make something more accessible, and so on and so on. Define the problem. What are you trying to do? So again, this is still about the problem. Ideate, which is to say create ideas. So think big, just come up with as many different ideas as possible. Nothing is ruled out to start with. Just any possible solution gets counted in. It doesn't matter if it's going to be expensive or whatever, just come up with the idea. Come up with the test model, actually test that model, and then just iterate and keep doing it again and again and again. Has it solved the original problem? Blah, blah, blah. And then when you run out of time, that's when you've got your design. Time will then, as an external factor, come in. Why is this relevant to academia? Well, firstly, studying is all about problems. I imagine if you haven't noticed this already, you will now. Everything you're working on is a problem. But where's the problem? What is the actual problem? So is the problem that atheists and theists can't agree? Probably not. Is the problem that they're talking about different things in different ways? Yeah, probably. So how do I solve that problem? That's where I should be looking. You get much more invested in something when you know that there's a problem to address and that you can address it. So what is the problem that I'm trying to address? How do I go about addressing that problem? You know, again, it's like study skill sessions. One of my horrors, which is what I was principally worried about it most for this session, is that you come into my session, you leave exactly the same as you came in. You come to the study skill session, you go, I'm not going to change anything. That's my horror. So this is why I'm trying to give practical things for you to do, to at least think about what's the problem. And this is how I would say it speaks to some of the stuff I've talked about in previous sessions around note-taking, for instance, when you're coming up with those analytic questions for each source. What's the problem that the author's trying to solve? Do they solve that problem? Some of these are really useful questions, because if you keep the focus on the problem, you are not going wrong at all. Doesn't matter what your supervisor says, I will fundamentally challenge them on that. Send them my way if they disagree. But I don't think they will disagree. I think any supervisor will say, yeah, if you're focused on the problem and looking at trying to get a solution for it, then you're on the right track. So it's all about solving a problem, but it's about getting clear about what that problem is. You can't just take things for granted and say, too many immigrants is a problem. It's not a problem, because that's not where the problem lies. The problem has to be for a person. Who's the problem for? Oh, ultimately it's for the immigrants themselves. That's a different kind of reaction that you suddenly have. And you can challenge my thinking on that. You can say, oh, Alex, I think you went wildly wrong there. I think the problem is with them coming into the country, in which case, fine, articulate that. Where's the problem? Who and who's it for? And this is a little bit about, just working out charting your own path a little bit. So you're probably aware of Cambridge having these centres: the Centre for Existential Risk, the Centre for the Future of Intelligence, the Centre for Digital Built Britain. There are more. The centres, interestingly enough, seem to be centred around problems, not least global warming, AI, and what's the future of Britain going to be now that we don't have high streets, which is quite a practical problem, but I think it's a genuine one. How do we make sure that people can get access to goods easily when roads can't cope with the amount of traffic that we have, for instance, things like that? Are drones going to change things fundamentally? How do we design a town based on drones? We need a landing pad on the roof, do we? Or something like that. All those sorts of questions come up. The colleges are arguably multidisciplinary too, because the colleges, again, like I said, I'm sitting next to someone who's a chemist and I say, you can't possibly be a realist. This isn't a conversation they would have had with another chemist. It's just not something that they would have talked about. So this is about harnessing what's valuable about that environment. And skills are multidisciplinary. There is no way in which you're using critical thinking for philosophy, but not using it in the same way for history. You might use it less, I don't know. Actually, I do know, I studied history as well, and you use it about the same amount, to be honest. So the point here is that you can sort of get your points on the page, your knowledge graph, right? You can say, I've got all these facts, and you can follow the experiences of other people and say, this connects with this, so-and-so disagrees with so-and-so. That's the debate. That's where you should be writing about. And that's the experience side of things. You're learning from other people. These aren't bad. These are all necessary to then the next stage, where you start drawing your own lines. The dots are in exactly the same place. The facts do not change. You are making connections in surprising ways. I really apologize for the kind of primary school graphics here. But I think it conveys the point quite well. This idea that it's not just about finding straight lines that other people have told you to draw between certain dots. It's about finding your own shape that you want to cast out of these dots. And I would even say it's not about using all of them. It's just about finding your path. So it's about having, and this unifies everything I've said so far, I think, in which is useful, and kind of like me drawing my own little cat, right? It's about connecting self-enrichment with individual needs and global efforts. It's about recognizing flow, and it's about recognizing design thinking in all of this. And all of it, ultimately, if you take nothing away from this session, it's about recognizing that the curriculum that you're following in your studies isn't something you have to do busy work to solve. It's supposed to help you to become more enriched, more creative, more self-actualized people. And that's me. I'm done. So if anyone wants to, and I haven't gone into a lot of specifics, and it's much easier to do specifics on a one-to-one basis. So if you want to set up a supervision with me, that's the email address to send me an email, and I'll happily set up a one-to-one in term or out of term. That question comes up a lot. So it's not like a standard supervision. It doesn't have to be an hour long. It can be 20 minutes. It can just be helping you to sort of think creatively about an assignment. You can send me an essay and I can annotate it, and then we can talk about my annotations, or we can just talk on the back of, you know, I'm looking to do this. I want this to happen. You know, how do I make that happen? And I'm no expert. I never am, but I can help you to try and see which way you want to go with that thinking. So any questions?